Good morning, Dr. Dolakia. Good afternoon, rather.
Good afternoon.
And Dr. Hi, good afternoon.
Hello. Good afternoon,
madam.
friends.
Yeah.
I welcome you all at very good afternoon, friends. Dr. Rushi, Dr. Bab, Mahmood Merchant, Dr. Atul Doshi, and friends. I welcome you all at this 300th webinar. We have with us Dr. Atul Doshi to moderate today's discussion. I request him to start the proceeding. Dr. Doshi.
Yeah, good afternoon, sir. Today's chairperson, we have a senior most family physician, Dr. Mahmood A. Merchant, practicing since last 54 years, past president of GPA, now scientific convener, recipient of Dr. L.U. Kriplani Lifetime Achievement Award, presented many papers in GPA conference, received several prizes. Only GPA who has taught ECG for more than 5,000 doctors in Mumbai, Thane, and Pune. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Atul Bhai. Thank you very much. First of all, let me congratulate Dr. B.K. Dolakia and Jaslok Hospital for the 300th webinars today. And fantastic. I really salute Dr. Dolakia for doing a great job. He is our master teacher. You know, Dr. Gunwan said used to call him master, and he's really a master for that. And thank you for inviting me to introduce Dr. Ruchi Samdani, who is a great nephrologist who has done her MBBS from Manipal Hospital, Karnataka. And then she went to USA and Mount Sinai Hospital. She did her MD and then FACC Fellow American Cardiology. She did her DNB from Jaslok Hospital. She was a lecturer in Grand Medical JJ Hospital. And now she's attached to Jaslok Hospital as a consultant nephrologist. She's been doing a lot of work apart from the disease of the kidney. The transplant, she's excellent in the transplant nephrologist, and a lot of work she has done in kidney. If I see her CV, it is a big lecture by itself. So I'm sorry, madam. It is wonderful to meet you. You can go ahead with your talk. And today's topic is one of the important topic for GPs. And she's going to talk about failing kidneys, and every GP should know in and out of the failing kidney. Dr. Ruchi Samdani, to you.
Thank you, Dr. Merchant. Thank you, Dr. Dholakia, for giving me this opportunity and having me at this GPA to talk on this very important and pertinent topic, failing kidneys. It's actually, this topic is almost like entire nephrology combined in 80 minutes. So I only have 80 minutes to prove myself. So I better start very fast. So I've divided my talk into 3 sections. The first section is going to be about the clinical manifestation. What is CKD and the manifestations of CKD? The second part is diagnosis, and the third would be the most pertinent also, management. I'm not going to be delving into things which have been spoken multiple times over the last couple of decades. I'm going to be trying to do newer treatments and newer modalities which should be utilized in CKD management. So this brings me to the first slide, which is what is the epidemiology of kidney failure. There is an increased prevalence of kidney disease. 1 in 10 adults is affected by kidney disease, and 1.2 million deaths are happening worldwide because of kidney disease. This definitely there's a huge financial drain because of this, and the number one leading causes for this is diabetes and hypertension. So that is these are numbers which everyone is very aware of in our day-to-day practice. The CKD risk is rising. The younger patients are getting affected. Now we are getting not only the geriatric population, but also the younger patients we're getting who have elevated creatinine levels. And this brings me to a very important and pertinent role of family doctors and primary care physicians in diagnosis and management, because you're actually the first point of care for the patients, and hence picking up kidney disease or chronic kidney disease is extremely important, and that is going to rule how their future years are going to be. So what is chronic kidney disease? Chronic kidney disease is defined as an abnormality in the structure or function of the kidney, which is present for a minimum of 3 months. So 3 months is very important. So if you see a snapshot, if you see a single creatinine level that does not hold that much meaning, and if you need a baseline to be able to compare it from, unless you have other parameters to guide your diagnosis of chronic kidney disease. So till about a decade ago, the CKD definition was based only on GFR, and we went from stage 1 to stage 5 based on how the levels of, sorry, this is come like this, based on how the GFR criteria was. So stage 1 was very mild, and as you went from stage 1 to stage 5 was CKD. Stage 5 was when the GFR was less than 15 and patients required dialysis or kidney replacement therapy. Then they realized all over that it was not only the GFR which was actually important and instrumental in diagnosis of CKD. It was also other parameters like albuminuria and proteinuria, which also guided how severe the CKD is, what the risk of progression is, and how these patients should be dealt with. Hence, the current diagnosis of CKD not only rests on GFR, but also on albuminuria. So this is a very important table which is here. It on the horizontal axis, you see the albuminuria, which is based on the degree of protein excretion, that's albumin excretion. They have 3 categories, A1, A2, and A3. So depending on how severe the albuminuria is. And on the y-axis, you're seeing vertically, it is G1 to G5, which is based on the GFR criteria. So if you just have a look at this, you see yellow, green, yellow, orange, and red. And the severity of risk of CKD progression is most obviously when as the GFR is high and the proteinuria is high. And so if you see G1, which is the first on the GFR's category, and A1, that is less than 30 milligrams of albuminuria. These patients, you can just monitor, you just screen them and monitor them. And even at the same GFR of more than 90, if the patient has more than 300 milligrams of proteinuria, these are patients which should be targeted and should be treated, picked up early and treated. So same thing goes for if you see the G3. G3 is when the GFR is between 30 to 60. There are 2 stages in that, G3A and G3B, depending on the GFR. And even as you see in G3A, which is 45 to 60 GFR, when the proteinuria is less, they have a lesser chance of CKD progression versus when the proteinuria increases. So proteinuria or albuminuria should be kept in mind whenever you diagnose a patient with CKD, because that is an important prognostic factor as to how they are going to be treated and what is their risk of progression, not only for CKD, but also for the other complications that come with CKD as well. So this brings me to the very important things. Who are the vulnerable population? Who should be screened for CKD? This includes all diabetics, hypertensives, elderly patients, patients with renal stones, autoimmune diseases like lupus, malignancy patients, recurrent UTIs, obese patients, patients who are smokers, or patients who are using analgesics like NSAIDs. All these patients are extremely vulnerable for chronic kidney disease. We should screen them, should keep a close eye on them, and if they diagnosed with CKD, should be treated in a very appropriate and aggressive fashion. What are the clinical features? So now that we know what chronic kidney disease or CKD is, we have defined it by the GFR criteria and the albumin excretion criteria. Now, how do we pick up CKD? So the early stages of CKD, the symptoms can be extremely non-specific. They can be just fatigue, loss of energy. Some patients who may have nocturia or early signs of, which may be an early sign of impaired concentrating ability in the kidney. As the GFR declines, clinical manifestations start increasing. They have features of fluid retention in the form of edema of the feet, ankles, face. loss of appetite, nausea, unintentional weight loss, dry, itchy skin. I think this is also a manifestation which is extremely common. Foamy urine. A lot of patients come and complain of froth or foam and bubbles in the urine. And oliguria happens as the CKD progresses or GFR declines. So these are all, in a nutshell, signs of water retention. However, there is a large percentage of patients who may be completely asymptomatic until stage 3, and these are the patients who require proactive screening. So definitely there are patients who may present early because of the manifestations, or there may be a large chunk of patients who may be completely asymptomatic till stage 3. They may have poor concentration, sleep disturbances, or other manifestations of CKD. Hypertension. Is this a cause or is this an effect of CKD? This is something which should be looked into and managed in a very appropriate fashion. I think that is the number one pickup which at the family doctor at level you are is always checked and taken into note. Any patient who has difficult to control hypertension, is especially hypertension which is resistant to more than 3 drugs, including a diuretic, should prompt evaluation of CKD. So if a patient is is hypertensive, they may be having essential hypertension, and suddenly the pattern of their hypertension changes, then also we should think of CKD. So being a chronic hypertensive does not exclude a new development of a GFR decline, and hence hypertension should be monitored very, very closely. As the stages of CKD progress, pulmonary edema, altered mentation, or altered sensorium start coming into being. Severe hyperkalemia, this is obviously a laboratory finding. These patients may have a lot of weakness. They may start complaining in the lower extremities, usually the ascending lower extremities, upper extremities. And with severe level, at very, very high levels of potassium, they can also have flaccid paralysis. These are some of the neuromuscular manifestations. Otherwise, they can have tachyarrhythmias, and they palpit and complain of chest pain, palpitation should be looked into. Low urine output, definitely a very important and a marker of low decrease in the GFR. So CKD is an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease. These patients with CKD usually may not die of CKD by itself. They may die of a cardiovascular disease. A cardiovascular event may be responsible for their increased mortality, and therefore CKD is actually also an coronary artery disease equivalent. Traditional risk factors like diabetes, hypertension, and metabolic syndrome should be taken care of to control CKD. So this slide actually, this was a study which was done by Kidney Warriors, and telling us what has been the first reaction to diagnosis of patients with CKD. So when we tell a patient who has CKD, 88% of patients were in denial. 29% of them were shocked with disbelief. 16% tried Ayurveda or homeopathy. 12% cried and quit. 21% decided to go for a second opinion and they were shopping. There were only 22% of patients who accepted the diagnosis and decided to start therapy. So this brings you to a very important question, that because it is silent, CKD many times remains silent. So acceptance of the diagnosis becomes a very big problem, and hence initiation of therapy also becomes a very big problem in such patients. They're mostly either in denial that the report is wrong, they do not have symptoms, and they are then hence many times lost to follow-up. Sorry. My slides are not coming properly actually. The slides are not coming properly. Can I just reload my slides?
Yes, madam.
Yeah, can I just reload them?
Yes,
Yeah,
please, ma'am.
madam. Go ahead.
Because they're not coming out properly. I'm
Yeah.
not seeing a large number of
Okay,
them. Yeah,
okay,
just give me 2 minutes. I'm just going to stop share and I will share again. Avinash, now I have to. Let's see. I don't know why it's coming. Okay, now it is better. Okay. So red flag symptoms I just spoke about: pulmonary edema, altered sensorium, hyperkalemia, and low urine output. These are red flags and should be noted immediately. So CKD is an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease, and these traditional risk factors like diabetes, hypertension, and metabolic syndrome should be treated extremely aggressively. First reaction: why do symptoms appear late? Now, this brings me to a very, very important point, which is what is renal reserve. So, renal reserve is a concept which is now very, very prevalent. So, the kidneys actually they function 60 to 70% of their maximum capacity. The filtration, the nephrons filter at a normal GFR. They are functioning 60 to 70% of the capacity. Whenever under stress, they can increase their capacity by these compensatory mechanisms, and hence they will be able to take over at the time of stress. When the renal reserve is lost, that is when the GFR starts declining and you start seeing a rise in the creatinine. So by the time you start seeing a rise in the creatinine, the patient has lost the substantial amount of their GFR and because of the loss in the renal reserves. And that is the reason that the symptoms appear late, because they have already lost a significant amount of GFR. So CKD diagnosis is based on the symptoms, and azotemia or symptoms of more than 3 months. 3 months is extremely important, and imaging, which may be supportive as well. I'm going to just talk about imaging on the next few slides. So what are the blood tests we are going to be sending for our patients when they come up? Diagnosis of CKD. So the first thing which we all send is hemoglobin, electrolytes creatinine to see the sodium, potassium, creatinine to check the GFR, calcium, phosphorus, uric acid. They are extremely important for as the GFR declines, there is alteration in the metabolism of calcium, phosphorus, and uric acid. Total protein albumin, how is that significant for CKD? Because if patients have albuminuria, the serum albumin levels will be low. Urine analysis, most underused but most important test. It is actually a window into the kidney. It gives us a lot of information about the type of kidney disease happening, and should be done definitely. Urine albumin creatinine ratio tells us about the degree of protein excretion, and ultrasound. So GFR, eGFR estimation. Now, eGFR or estimated GFR is a calculated value. This is calculated based on demographic data, that is the age and the gender of the patient. Earlier, weight was also taken into account. There are formulas to calculate it, and based on those formulas, you get the eGFR. The creatinine is unfortunately one of the most prevalent biochemical markers for estimation of GFR. Not the greatest, but one of the few tools we have for quick estimation. It is affected by muscle mass, age, sex, hydration, and ethnicity. And we should remember that increase in creatinine may not always be renal. And hence, every rise in the creatinine, you should look into a number of other factors which play a role in showing a high creatinine. Cystatin C is another marker for GFR estimation. It is good under certain circumstances, especially if patients who are sarcopenic. It's a great marker. Patients who have liver disease, also a good marker for measurement. However, this also has its flaws. It's affected by thyroid function. Hyperthyroidism causes high cystatin C. Systemic inflammation also affects it. Corticosteroid use. So recently, I had a patient who came in. He was an elderly gentleman. He was diabetic, hypertensive, and had rheumatoid arthritis and lupus. And they were doing serial testing. They were very, very, very aware patients, and they were doing serial testing almost every month because of the multiple medications they were on. And the creatinine levels were steady at a 1, and the cystatin C was slowly going up. This patient had a recent flare of lupus and had been on corticosteroids. So they came to me because of the high level of cystatin C but normal creatinine. And definitely it was because of the steroids. Steroids cause a C levels, which does not translate into an low eGFR. Hence, it is not that cystatin C is without its flaws. It should be looked also into with fair amount of concern. I mean, with the properly, you should look into what are the medication list, what is the health status of the patient, and then see what the GFR estimation is. Some cancers can raise cystatin C. Smoking also has a small, but may have an elevation in the cystatin C. eGFR formulas now, which use both creatinine and cystatin C, definitely would be better markers for eGFR estimation versus either of them alone. A big red flag is always a rapid drop in eGFR. So if we have a patient who's had a GFR of 55, 60 or any level, and you see a sudden drop in the GFR, it is a red flag, should be looked into. Why is this sudden drop in GFR? This is not obviously a chronic kidney disease. It is an acute injury which has happened, should be taken into account and measures taken to reverse that. Urine dipstick is one of the very, very useful screening tools for diagnosis of underlying kidney disease. We can pick up early proteinuria, trace to 3+, hematuria, WBCs, pus cells, nitrite, leukoestrase. They suggest underlying urine infections. So urine dipstick should not be overlooked. Important tool. Urine studies are extremely important in diagnosing the type of chronic kidney disease the patient has and should not be overlooked. Should be ordered and should not be overlooked. So this is protein in the urine, RBCs, WBCs. So these tell us whenever I look at a urine sample and I am able to differentiate the different parts of the kidney, which the nephron rather, which are involved in the underlying kidney disease. So if there is protein leak, I know it is the glomerulus. Especially if there's nephrotic range proteinuria or even subnephrotic proteinuria, the etiology then has to be determined. RBCs and WBCs, RBCs, microscopic hematuria indicates an underlying nephritis. If the creatinine levels have been persistently high, should be looked into, like, is it IgA nephropathy? Is it a chronic glomerulonephritis? WBCs definitely indicate pus cells, and RBC cast and WBC cast can also happen in nephritis. So urine studies extremely important, should be ordered and reviewed along with the blood tests. Ultrasound. Now, ultrasound is actually become a very, very important marker for an investigation in diagnosis of kidney disease. it tells us about the chronicity. So firstly, whenever I see a patient with a high creatinine, it's important to see how long, especially many times we don't have patients who have a baseline. How do I ascertain is this rise in the creatinine, has it been historically there, or is this something new? So ultrasound is a very important marker by which I'm able to ascertain the temporal relation of the creatinine. The size of the kidneys becomes small, especially in hypertensive patients. So it's extremely important to see the size. Chronic analgesic nephropathy. So if a patient gives you a history that they've been taking a lot of NSAIDs and the size of the kidneys is small, it tells us that the chance of reversibility is negligible. Also, diabetic patients, on the other hand, will have normal sized kidneys, but the chronicity changes can be seen in the form of corticomedullary differentiation. So ultrasound is an extremely important parameter which should be looked into for assessing chronic kidney disease. So this is telling me size, echogenicity, obviously obstruction. If there's any obstruction will be picked up. And Doppler of the renal vessels also extremely important. Patients who have come up with sudden pulmonary edema, flash pulmonary edema, or patients who were otherwise normotensive, who's a vasculopath, who has peripheral vascular disease, and now their pressures are becoming uncontrolled, should look into, is there an underlying renal artery stenosis, should be looked, and hence Doppler is extremely important in diagnosis. CT or MRI, other imaging modalities, not very frequently done for CKD, but are important in certain conditions, like especially cystic kidney diseases like autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease, to assess the total kidney volume as a marker of severity of disease and to predict the rate of progression. CT, MRIs or imaging is also used for obstruction, to evaluate obstruction, and for pyelonephritis. So now we come to the third part of the talk, which is now what is the management strategies we can utilize for CKD. So we have patients who've come to us with the clinical manifestations. We have identified them. We have sent off their blood tests, their urine test, and we have done their imaging. So we have established that they have CKD. What can we as doctors now do to prevent the CKD, to slow the progression of CKD? So the general measures are that first, of course, let us treat all the reversible causes. It's important that we prevent or slow the progression of CKD, treat the complications of CKD. GFR estimation becomes extremely important now for drug dosing because we don't want to under or overdose them. And identification of which patients are now progressing fast and require renal replacement therapy, either in the form of dialysis or kidney transplantation. First and most important, let's start with the basics. Blood pressure control. 85% of patients with CKD have hypertension. Control of blood pressure is extremely important. The goal should be less than 130/80, especially so with patients who have albuminuria. The proteinuria patient, they have a very high risk of cardiovascular disease as well. So control of blood pressure is imperative in not only renal health, but also cardiovascular health. We should correct the volume overload in such patients with CKD with diuretics, appropriate diuretics. I'm not going to go into details of what would be the choice of antihypertensives to use in such patients, but controlling is extremely important, and follow up on the control. So slowing the rate of progression, blood pressure control the other reversible factors, or rather other factors like hyperlipidemia, metabolic acidosis, tubular interstitial disease. So if they have been taking any NSAIDs, any analgesics, any Chinese herbs, any out-of-the-box things, any copper therapy, variety of therapies nowadays patients try and do, all those should be immediately stopped because they increase tubular interstitial disease, and therefore these things should be stopped so that you can slow the rate of progression of kidney disease. So now I'm going to over the next 10-15 minutes talk about what are the new kids on the block. I'm not going to delve into things which we already also know. The new kids on the block for CKD are SGLT2 inhibitors and non-steroidal mineralocorticoid receptor antagonist. So the SGLT2 inhibitors are two, dapagliflozin and empagliflozin, and the non-steroidal MRAs is finerenone. So let's delve into deeply into the two of these. So what is SGLT2 inhibitors? So this is SGLT2 stands for sodium glucose cotransporter 2 inhibitor. So this is actually a channel which is present in the proximal tubule. It functions by increasing the reabsorption of sodium and glucose in the proximal tubule. What was found was that when you block this channel, the sodium and glucose reabsorption decreases, and hence there is increase in the glucose excretion in the urine. It was started off like a anti-diabetic medication, but I think it has found a lot of importance and benefit in the cardiovascular and in the field of nephrology. Common agents which I think all of us use is empagliflozin and dapagliflozin. So it blocks the SGLT2 channels in the proximal tubule. Less glucose and sodium is reabsorbed. Hence, there is more glucose lost in the urine. This leads to low blood sugar. That's why it was initially started off with as an anti-diabetic. It also increases the intraglomerular pressure, has a mild diuretic effect. Therefore, it is useful in heart failure as well, and lowers the blood pressure of approximately 2 to 4 mm. So it has a myriad effects on the cardiovascular and renal and the endocrine front. So a couple of studies which were done for it. I'm going to talk about one which was useful for nephrologists. This was the EMPA Kidney Collaborative Study. It was a landmark trial in NEJM, the empagliflozin in kidney in patients with chronic kidney disease. This was a large, randomized, double-blinded, placebo-controlled clinical trial. It studied the effect of once daily empagliflozin treatment on the progression of kidney disease and cardiovascular disease. So both kidney and cardiovascular outcomes were there, and to examine the safety profile of the drug in a wide range of patients with CKD. This study was conducted across 241 centers in 8 countries. And it had a large number of patients, 6,600 patients with CKD. Their GFR was between 20 to 45 or higher. So up till 90 of GFR was accepted, and albuminuria of at least 200. Included both diabetic and non-diabetic. So it was not only for patients with diabetes, but even non-diabetic patients were also included. So 6,600 patients were enrolled in this study. Very large study across 241 centers in 8 countries. And what did we find? The primary outcome was to see the composite of progression of kidney disease, defined as end-stage kidney disease, or a sustained eGFR decline of a decline of eGFR to less than 10, or a sustained GFR decline of more than 40% from baseline, or death from renal or cardiovascular cause. This was the primary outcome. The secondary outcome was the heart failure or cardiovascular death, all-cause hospitalization or all-cause death. So they had both kidney and renal and cardiovascular outcomes. And what did they find? The Jardiance or empagliflozin phase 3 EMPA kidney trial was stopped early due to clear positive efficacy in people with CKD. So they realized that these patients had a benefit, and it was no point continuing the trial for longer because they already found a benefit. It is the largest and broadest dedicated SGLT2 inhibitor trial in CKD to date. And this was a very, very big announcement for the nephrologist also, that here we have a medication which can be used to decrease the progression of CKD. So the hazard ratio in this was 0.72. So this graph is showing this only, that there was almost a 28% benefit and decrease in the progression of kidney disease and cardiovascular events in patients who were on empagliflozin versus the placebo. So that's a very large benefit of 28%. So this is something that cannot be ignored, and that so one of the EMPA kidney co-investigators, he said that we know there is an urgent need for new therapies proven to delay CKD progression, which can lead to the need for dialysis or transplantation. Today's results demonstrate that empagliflozin may benefit adults at risk of progression, including those with or without diabetes and across a wide range of kidney functions. So it is an important landmark study, important announcement for everyone that patients with CKD, diabetic or non-diabetic, you have this new kid on the block which can delay the progression of CKD, and you should offer it to your patients. The age-old ACE ARBs, which we already know about, I think that was till maybe 5 years ago. This was the only thing which was available for CKD progression. Patients should have this on their prescription. Hopefully, they tolerate it. Hopefully, we monitor them for hyperkalemia. It does decrease albuminuria, decreases the intraglomerular pressure, and a higher decrease in the albumin excretion is associated with a more rapid decline. Preservation of the GFR. Benefits of ACE-ARBs are both in diabetic and non-diabetic patients, and this is a medication which should be definitely offered to them. I think there's some problem in the slides, so you're not being able to see the left hand of the slides. But this slide talks about the spironolactone. So this also reduces the albumin mineralocorticoid receptor antagonist, reduces albumin excretion when added to ACE-ARBs. There were meta-analysis show that spironolactone 25 per day added to ACE or ARBs, there was a significant reduction in the albuminuria. It reduces BP also. The side effect, of course, is hyperkalemia, which we are all aware of and should be monitored closely. This brings me to the second new kid on the block, finerenone. This is a non-steroidal mineralocorticoid receptor antagonist and has been shown to decrease the CKD progression and cardiovascular events in adults with CKD associated with diabetes. It is approved in India with the indication in all adults with CKD associated with diabetes to reduce the risk of sustained eGFR decline, end-stage kidney disease, cardiovascular death, non-fatal MIs, and hospitalization or heart failures. So this medication has also come on the forefront for diabetic kidney disease. This is not a blanket drug for everyone. Finerenone is for diabetic kidney disease to decrease the progression of kidney disease, versus SGLT2s, which are for now being used for all patients. All patients with CKD, they may be diabetic, they may be non-diabetic. They got a 27% benefit in their GFR decline when they were on SGLT2 inhibitors versus the placebos. So that's a very important thing to take note of. Okay, I think there's some problem in the formatting of these slides. So this is actually a slide in which I was comparing the three medications, the non-steroidal mineralocorticoid antagonist and the steroidal mineralocorticoid antagonist. So eplerenone, spironolactone, and finerenone. So spironolactone is age-old. Everyone has used it multiple times. Eplerenone also being used. And the newest kid was finerenone. So the benefit of finerenone is that it is a non-steroidal mineralocorticoid receptor antagonist. It is highly selective and showed lesser sexual side effects in finerenone treated patients versus spironolactone treated patients. It has a short half-life, and therefore the risk of even if the hyperkalemia is there, it is out of the system very fast. The risk of hyperkalemia is lesser in patients with finerenone versus definitely eplerenone and spironolactone. So that is a benefit for us, because these patients, this is a class of patients will be offered to patients who are already on ACE or ARBs. This would be the second agent added to them. So they already have a low GFR, they have ACE ARBs. We are adding finerenone. We do not want to compound their risk of hyperkalemia. We want the entire prescription to get tolerated. So finerenone comes as a breather, because usually once you start it, the rise in the serum potassium level is not more than 0.1 or 0.2. So if you have a patient who has a 3.5 or 4 potassium, you can very safely start them on finerenone. Even if they have a 4.5 potassium, finerenone can be started. Repeat the potassium levels after a week. See if the potassium levels are high. If the potassium is more than 5.2, you can stop it or decrease the dose. Give them the potassium binders and then take it forward. So the difference in the chemical structures may explain the properties of the non-steroidal MRAs versus the steroidal MRAs. Finerenone is an extremely bulky molecule. It attaches to the mineralocorticoid receptors, is extremely selective, and that is the reason they have less breast-related side effects, lesser hyperkalemia. It does have effect on the blood pressure as well. This is a slide which is actually showing now, as per the KDIGO, that's the Kidney Disease Initiative Global Outcome Group. Patients of CKD with diabetes, they have 3 pillars for treatment now, which is the RAS inhibitors, which we already all know, the non-steroidal MRAs, that is finerenone, and the SGLT2 inhibitors. These patients should be offered all 3 and monitored for side effects. If the prescription is suitable for them, in the sense that they're able to tolerate the side effects of these, or they do not have any side effects, it definitely will help in decreasing the decline of GFR and hence better renal health. The second part, so we've spoken about declining the progression of CKD. The first way to do that, of course, is early diagnosis. Then it was control of blood pressure, control of other risk factors, your ACE ARBs, SGLT2 inhibitors, mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists, both the steroidal and the non-steroidal. And the one thing which is actually has been utilized all over all through the ages is protein restriction. I'm going to talk about protein restriction a little bit more in detail. Of course, smoking cessation does decrease the CKD progression, treatment of metabolic acidosis, glycemic control in diabetes. So dietary contribution to CKD. So diet plays a very, very important role in CKD, because because of the urea production, because of the electrolytes, because of the sodium load that the nephrons have to deal with. So the first study, diet is an underutilized strategy by clinicians in their goal to prevent or slow progression of CKD or ESRD in the management of CKD-related complications. It is the cornerstone strategy in prevention and management of 2 syndromes like diabetes and hypertension for sure, and it is also helpful in delaying the CKD progression. Should be utilized, should be counseled. So this I'm going to talk about a little bit. This was a study which was done in Newton. This was So this was ameliorating CKD using a whole food plant-based diet. So what they found in this study was that those patients who were on a plant-based diet, the plant-based diet offers benefits that slow the progression of CKD, decrease the incidence of cardiovascular disease, decrease rates of diabetes, obesity, decreased inflammation, cholesterol, and hence delays the kidney failure and initiation of dialysis. Those patients who were on animal-based protein diet, they had an acidic environment, more inflammation, renal hyperfiltration, and therefore these patients had a slightly higher rate of decline on GFR. So the plant-based diets are being advocated now. They are safer in CKD versus animal-based diet. Does that mean patients should completely go off non-vegetarian food or plant or animal non-vegetarian food? My answer would be no. I think it can be eaten in moderation, and it should be individualized. This was a recent paper in American Journal of Kidney Diseases, where they showed that diet plays an extremely important role right from the beginning till the end. So whenever the CKD risk factors are there, like obesity, diabetes, hypertension, smoking, all of these diets should be taken into account. Optimize glycemic control with diet, weight loss, antihypertensive medications, consider weight loss interventions, decrease salt, decrease processed food, increase physical activity. Once the patient has been diagnosed with CKD, so they may have hyperlipidemia, proteinuria, hyperinsulinemia, hyperglycemia. Again, less salt. Increase fruits and vegetables, keeping into account the potassium load. Consider weight loss intervention. Reduce saturated fat. As the GFR is declining, what are the other additional factors or interventions via diet that can be taken into optimize the fluid intake, lower the animal protein intake, optimize fruits and vegetables? Again, that should be taken into account, keeping the potassium levels in mind, reduce salt intake, increase unsaturated fats and whole grains. Once the patient is has complete kidney failure, means he is on dialysis, they will be having all the troubles that come with CKD5, dyslipidemia, inflammation, malnutrition, mineral and bone disorder. So for all of that, the protein intake once the patient is on dialysis should be 1 to 1.2 gram per kg per day. So just to give you an idea, when the patient is on stage 1 to stage 4 or stage 5, not on dialysis, the protein intake is weight based. There is no one protein intake fits all. There is no blanket rule like that. The average Indian vegetarian diet is extremely poor in protein. So hence we should individualize it. The patients should be given a diet which is approximately 0.6 to 0.7 grams per kg per day. It is a weight-based diet that should be given. So the protein allowance is weight-based. Should be then analyzed whether are they even taking that much of protein or not, rather than just completely cutting pulses and dairy products off them, rather than completely cutting protein and pulses and dairy products out of their diet. We should individualize it. And salt is a very important, plays an extremely important role in CKD. So hidden salt is there that should be taken into account. All your packaged food should be completely, it's a complete no-no. High in urate, high in phosphate, high in salt. Absolute no-no for patients with kidney disease. The package inserts should be read. Anything which is high fructose content, absolutely no for patients with kidney disease and should not be taken by them. So this is a diagram which is it's a cartoon diagram which is just showing you that how each food, the red arrows are the bad arrows and the green arrows show that they are the good ones. So you see the plant protein increases the plasma bicarbonate, the dietary fiber inhibits the uremic toxins like the endoxin sulfates and the precursile sulfates. If you potassium, of course, fruits and vegetables are good, but you should take into account hyperkalemia. Phosphates, animal protein, fructose containing things, all should be completely avoided. They increase the progression of CKD and they should not be taken. So again, just putting, I would like everyone to understand that there is no blanket diet for patients. Each patient's diet should be analyzed, should see what is their current intake. Salt is a very big problem in our country. We are very salt heavy country actually, because whether it is our snacks, it is our meals, everything is it is chaat, it is any kind of food, it is very salt heavy, and hence increased salt intake leads to a lot of water retention, hypertension, hence progression of kidney disease, decline in GFR. Salt should not be underestimated. So more than protein intake, which is as it is low in the diet, salt is something they should be made aware of and should be cut down. So now I've spoken about what are the ways in which we can delay the progression of CKD. Let's talk about some complications of CKD which are pertinent clinically. Hyperkalemia, very important, frequently seen. Potassium levels of more than 5 are significant. 5 to 5.5 is high normal. As the levels go higher from 5.5 to 6.5, patients start getting, may not be
Madam, no voice, madam.
Unmute yourself, madam. Unmute.
okay. Yeah. Okay. Hyperkalemia patient treatment. So patients with hyperkalemia should be acted on very rapidly. So when the levels of potassium are more than 6.5, or you require stronger therapy, rapid acting agents. This therapy is usually given in the hospital. IV calcium gluconate, salbutamol, nebulization, soda bicarb, and glucose insulin drip. All this is actually hospital based management. The management for hyperkalemia, which we use at home, which is frequently prescribed, everyone has given it, is K-bind. Everyone, all the patients hate it. We all prescribe it left, right, and center, because that is the only potassium binder which is available which was available currently till a while back. It is sodium polystyrene sulfate. It's a sodium potassium exchange resin. It works in the colon. Onset is around 4 to 6 hours, and it removes potassium via the gut. Now we have a new kid on the block. So this is the third new kid I'm going to talk about. This is a potassium exchanger which is called Lokelma, or sodium zirconium cyclosilicate. It exchanges sodium and hydrogen for potassium across the GIT. So especially in the small and large intestine, it comes as 5-gram sachet. It needs to be mixed into a 45 ml of water. It is not does not get completely dissolved. The benefit of this is that it has a very rapid onset of action within 1 hour. So it is very useful for early stabilization of potassium levels. It's recently, just a week, 10 days, 2 weeks ago, or maybe maximum a month ago, it has now become available in India and can be prescribed for, especially for patients who do not like K-bind. The Lokelma is now available. It was available in the West for a couple of years, but now we also have it available for us. Because potassium binders actually are a very important part of our prescriptions, and that's why I decided to put this slide as well. The first one is K-bind. Second one is Patiromer, not available in India. The third one is Lokelma, or sodium zirconium cyclosilicate. The onset of action of the K-bind, which is frequently given, is 4 to 6 hours versus Lokelma is 1 hour. Both are ion exchanger. This is only for sodium, and that is sodium hydrogen exchanger. The side effect of K-bind would be GI necrosis, not frequently seen at all. I think the bigger concern than that is not being palatable and patients not complying to take it. Versus the Lokelma, it exchanges potassium for sodium. So some patients you do see edema, as edema or water retention may be there. So should be kept that, you need to keep that in mind as well. Other complications of CKD like fluid overload, you need to treat it with diuretics. Tell the patients they need to monitor their weight. Diuretic dose needs to be, that's a very dynamic complication, and that needs to be looked into very, very closely. Patients need to take their weight. They should have an idea about approximately how much urine they are making. If we do not necessarily need to be on a high dose diuretics for continuously. If they cut down their salt intake, cut down their water intake, you may be able to titrate the diuretics to lower possible doses. Bone and mineral disease, I'm not going to really get into the details of that. That's a very large topic by itself. But definitely patients with CKD have a lot of bone and mineral disease. It can be osteoporosis, high bone turnovers, and they have a very high risk of fractures. And that should not, hence patients with CKD, bone health should not be neglected at all. Anemia, very common complication of patients with CKD. Most patients are anemic. The reason for anemia is the low erythropoietin levels in them. Hence, supplementation with erythropoietin injections is required. Also should be monitored for iron deficiency with iron studies. Should do a stool local blood. These are patients who may have uremic gastritis, they may have ulcers. So if they have a low hemoglobin, could be by a multifactorial poor intake because of anorexia, low erythropoietin levels contributing to decreased production, and increased loss could be because of GI loss. So all three factors should be taken into account, and anemia treated aggressively. Anemia is one of those, the hemoglobin targets in patients with CKD is 10 to 11. We should try and get them there. And once we reach our target of approximately around 11, we need to come down on the doses of erythropoietin. As the patients with CKD progress from stage 1 to stage 5, the requirements for hemodialysis or renal replacement therapy starts coming in. The different methods of dialysis are hemodialysis, peritoneal dialysis, or if patients are acutely fluid overloaded, uremic, have very, very high hyperkalemia, having ECG changes, they may require emergency dialysis. And I'm not going to go into details of this because this is again a very large topic by itself. Kidney transplant offered also to patients who have CKD stage 5. Life with transplant is definitely better versus life on dialysis. Living donor and cadaver donors are two options. There is a ZTCC, which is the Zonal Transplant Committee. Patients should register in any one hospital which is registered for the cadaver transplant. And approximately right now, the time for transplant, cadaver transplant waiting time is around 3 to 4 years. Patients are listed based on their different blood groups, and they have various kinds of other points that are given based on the number of transplants, the vascular access issues, their how long they have been on dialysis for, and so this is about renal transplant. So this actually brings me to the end of my talk. I've tried to cover mostly the newer developments in CKD so that we are aware, rather than just talk about the entire CKD, which would be very exhaustive. And I'm just going to go over a couple of slides of quiz questions, and then I'll be happy to answer questions to the audience. So the first question is, there's a 58-year-old diabetic man. He presents with fatigue, breathlessness, and ankle swelling. He has a creatinine of 2.1. So now let's first, before we go into the options, let's first just analyze this. So here is a 58-year-old gentleman. He's diabetic. So on further interrogation, he said that he's diabetic for around 15 to 20 years. He has been undergone laser photocoagulation for the eyes, for diabetic retinopathy. He has amputated his left toe as well. Last year he did his creatinine levels. It was 2.0, and now we have a creatinine of 2.1. So first, let's see, does this patient have an acute kidney disease or a chronic kidney disease? So the high high creatinine level, has been there for more than 3 months. So this is chronic kidney disease. He is diabetic. He is a vasculopath, meaning he has involvement of diabetes not only in the eyes and in the extremity, because he's had a diabetic foot. So the chance that he has a diabetic kidney is very, very high. And so if we have to stage this patient, stage 1 would be more than 90 GFR. It's unlikely at a creatinine level of 2.1. Stage 5 is when he requires dialysis. And stage 3B due to diabetic kidney disease would be the most obvious, is the answer. The second question is, which marker best indicates chronic kidney disease progression risk? Is it hematuria, albuminuria, urine culture, or none of the above? So hematuria does not tell us anything about the progression of kidney disease. Patients can have hematuria it can be either glomerular or lower tract hematuria. That needs to be ascertained. How the most common causes of hematuria, of course, can be urine infections, but also IgA nephropathy. So it can be underlying nephritis. Hematuria by itself does not indicate CKD progression, so that is not the answer. Urine culture is an acute thing, does not indicate is not a marker of chronic kidney disease. So albuminuria or urine albumin creatinine ratio is an indicator which tells us about the progression of kidney disease. More the albuminuria, more higher the risk of CKD, and hence it's an important marker. Which drug class slows CKD progression and provides cardiovascular benefit? So this is now talking about the newer medications. So SGLT2 inhibitors, is it torsemide, is it antiplatelets, or are there no drugs which would slow the progression of chronic kidney disease? So the answer for this would be SGLT2 inhibitors, as shown by the various studies. Which potassium binder has the fastest onset of action? Is it Lokelma, K-bind, Ditor, or they all take very long?
Lokelma.
Lokelma, that's correct. What is the blood pressure target in CKD with albuminuria?
130/80.
30/80.
130/80, that's correct. So actually that brings me to the end of the talk. I'll be happy to answer any questions from the audience.
Excellent talk, madam.
Yes,
Congratulations.
nice.
Thank you.
Now,
Thank you,
madam,
ma'am.
you said about the creatinine we have been doing quite often, but the cystatin C we are not doing. Now, when
Yes.
will you indicate that when we should do the cystatin level?
The cystatin C would be useful to do in patients who have, especially patients who are sarcopenic. They have very low muscle mass. Patients who have liver disease. They are the patients who cystatin C would be helpful and should be done.
Okay.
Can
Now,
you
what is the-
elaborate, madam, on calcium and vitamin D? I mean, the renal.
Right. So,
relation.
calcium and vitamin D are actually very important in bone and mineral disease in CKD patients. Because see, the kidney is involved in the hydroxylation of vitamin D. So as kidney disease progresses, the hydroxylation of vitamin D, so the active vitamin D in your body goes down. As the active vitamin D in the body goes down, the reabsorption of calcium starts decreasing in the gut, in the cells, and hence these patients have low calcium levels. At the same time, the phosphorus levels start increasing as the CKD progresses. This usually we start seeing when the GFR is less than 30. So calcium, phosphorus, vitamin D, and PTH, all four are important parameters which need to be monitored. So calcium supplementation, definitely it should be seen. If the calcium levels are less than 9, should be supplemented. Phosphorus, we have phosphate binders. Phosphate binders are very important because why should we treat phosphorus? There's always a question. Patients ask, why do I need to take these phosphate binders? It's okay. It's not really causing any harm to me. What it does actually, phosphate binders are that the calcium phosphorus together, they cause, there's a lot of calcification which happens, metastatic calcification, and hence increase in the cardiovascular risk. So phosphate binders should be instituted to these patients, and phosphate binders can be calcium based, non-calcium based, things which are very often prescribed, like sevelamer carbonate. This is a non-phosphate based calcium binder, or lanum, or calcium carbonate can be also be. So the thing about phosphate binders is that you should always tell them that they have to take it with their meals. It should not be taken in isolation, because they bind the phosphorus which is there in the food you eat. So that's an important thing that should be noted. Some patients with CKD, they may have very low or normal phosphorus levels. So then and low, and the creatinine levels start going down. So these are also red flags. You should see that, is this patient getting malnourished? Why is the creatinine level? These patients, muscle mass is going down. They are not taking adequate protein. Is that the reason the phosphorus is going down and their muscle mass is going down? So all these parameters need to be seen in totality. I think it's very important to see the patient as completely as a whole versus just seeing the reports and treating the reports in CKD patients.
How to
Madam,
manage osteoporosis, man? Osteoporosis.
Right, sir. So for osteoporosis, most of these patients with the osteoporosis is extremely common in the CKD population. Can be treated with denosumab, calcium supplementation, vitamin D supplementation, treat the hyperparathyroidism, phosphate binders, and give denosumab or bisphosphonates. Bisphosphonates need to be used with caution. As the GFR declines, the utility goes down, and hence that's why denosumab is very frequently now administered. It's a once in 6 months. It has to be given subcutaneously, and total for 3 years.
Madam,
So
is there
what is
any
the-
contraindication of SGLT2 in CKD?
Sorry?
Any contraindication of SGLT2 in CKD?
So the contraindication would be SGLT2. The major side effects of SGLT2 inhibitors are urinary infections, genital infections. These are two things which can be a little debilitating for them. So any patient who has recurrent urine infections should not be advocating it to such patients.
What about EGFR?
So now, sir, they have also started the study which I showed, EMPA-CKD, that they have used from 25 to 90. They used EGFR, and now the current studies are also going on that they should be utilized even in lower GFRs and patients on dialysis as well, because they have the pleiotropic and cardiovascular benefit is major. So once the patient on dialysis, you obviously will not get any renal benefit out of it, but they get a lot of cardiovascular benefit. So this should be instituted in them as well.
What is renal osteodystrophy?
So renal osteodystrophy is the bone and mineral disorders which is seen in patients who have chronic kidney disease. This is divided into two types. There's a low bone turnover disease and high bone turnover disease. Both are extremely important, prevalent. Low bone turnover disease is like adynamic bone disease, osteoporosis, and the high bone turnover disease is osteitis fibrosa, mostly seen when the patients have hyperparathyroidism. Both things we should be taken into note. Patients who have osteoporosis or adynamic bone disease, you should treat them. Look at it. Why is that adynamic bone disease or low bone or osteoporosis? Calcium supplementation, again, phosphorus levels should be decreased. Parathyroid hormones should be treated. Sometimes in patients we do expect secondary parathyroidism in CKD population, but if the parathyroid levels are very high, if the range is more than 2 to 7 times of upper limit of normal of PTH levels is what we accept in CKD population. But if the level is more than that, if it is in the thousands, then we should always think that, is there a tertiary hyperparathyroidism? Is that parathyroid gland, which was secondary, was anyway producing a lot? Has it become autonomous and is making a lot of PTH PTH, and hence are we getting the high bone turnover disease in them? So these are all factors which we should look into when looking at bone health for CKD population.
Yes, when Dr. Maniar has asked, all pedal edema should be considered as renal involvement.
No, that's a very good question, but all pedal edema may not be renal at all. It can be cardiac, it can be hepatic or liver related. So all three things should be looked into. So in this, along with, if you're sending blood tests, definitely liver function and kidney function, both are important. Urine routine, again, I'm stressing upon it. The most inexpensive test, but a test which of great utility, gives us a lot of information about the kidney health should be sent, and cardiac, definitely, right side heart failure should be ruled out. You should evaluate with the 2D echo as well.
And calcium channel blocker, madam, I think.
And of course, drugs, calcium channel blocker. Absolutely, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
What is the role of alpha keto analog, madam?
So alpha keto analogs actually play an important role. There was a very large study which was done called the MDRD study, which was a landmark trial done in nephrology maybe 2 decades ago, in which they decided to see what are the benefit of different levels of protein intake on kidney progression, the decline in the GFR. So they divided the patients into normal protein intake, low protein, and very low protein intake. So the very low protein intake patients were given supplements of alpha keto analogs, and they found that these patients they had to be given the alpha keto analogs because they would otherwise get malnourished. So the alpha keto analog did help. They did not have a role to play in decreasing the decline in kidney function, but they were beneficial in the overall renal survival. So definitely they would have a role to play. Large number of studies have not proven benefit for this, but patients who are on a low protein diet, it would be beneficial to start them on alpha keto analogs.
Okay, madam. Madam, ACE inhibitors, especially ramipril, has significantly good role in control of proteinuria, or telmisartan is tentatively better.
So I think ACRB's head-to-head comparisons, both are equally better. Totally depends on the tolerance of the patient. Tolerability.
Okay, ma'am. Proteinuria is indicator of renal and cardiac dysfunction, both.
Proteinuria is indicator of
renal and cardiac dysfunction.
No, proteinuria would be indicative only of renal dysfunction, not cardiac dysfunction. Cardiac dysfunction, patients who have cardiac dysfunction but have normal kidneys will not have proteinuria. So a patient of cardiorenal syndrome will not have proteinuria. Only when the nephrons are involved, when the glomeruli are involved, is when you will have proteinuria. Of course, you can have other causes of proteinuria also, like exercise-induced proteinuria, postural proteinuria. So those are different. That's a completely different category of non-organic causes of proteinuria, or lifestyle-related disorders of proteinuria causing proteinuria. But definitely, proteinuria is renal involvement.
Okay, madam. Foam in urine does significant any renal pathology?
So foam in urine is a indicator of proteinuria, and definitely should be looked into. It's a important question to ask the patients, interrogate them, and if they do have foam, you should send not only a urine routine, but you should quantify the protein excretion also with a urine protein creatinine ratio or an albumin creatinine ratio. Okay, madam. Acylcysteine and taurine combination is used for what, and does it give better outcome? So N-acetylcysteine and taurine combination was utilized. It came into being, also called mucomix, came into the being for contrast nephropathy. And initial studies showed that it had an antioxidant effect and decreased the incidence of contrast nephropathy. However, multiple studies following that have not shown any benefit. So currently it's not advocated for benefit in CKD or contrast nephropathy.
Okay, madam. Dr. Sunita Pawar has asked renal cyst on USG and normal RFT, how to follow.
So renal cysts are actually something which is it is very important. It is and it's pertinent as per the age of the patient. So if you have a 20-year-old patient who has 5 cysts versus an 80-year-old patient who has 5 cysts, the 20-year-old with 5 cysts, it is kidney disease should be looked into, because this patient could be having chronic kidney disease, versus an 80-year-old who has cysts of 5 cysts. It could be just normal renal cysts, simple cysts, and I would not worry about it at all. So the age of the patient makes a lot of difference. Second thing is that what are the type of cysts? So there can be cysts are also classified on the different types. Is it type 1 Bosniak cyst, 2 cysts, type 3? So as the complexity of the cyst goes up, you should not ignore it. If they are type 2 or type 3, they may change character and should be followed very closely, because they may also become malignant. So they are typically for complexes, but the simple renal cyst in an adult who's, let's say, 50-year-old, 60-year-old, a simple renal cyst is of no trouble at all.
Okay, madam. Dr. Maniar has again asked renal kinetic disorders like incontinence, bladder spasm, prostate-related retention, strictures, dysuria, etc. has role in getting CKD.
Yeah, why not? Obstruction, why not?
Definitely,
Yes.
any symptoms or problems in the urinary tract will have it has. Sorry, I lost your question. What all was there?
Renal kinetic disorders like incontinence, bladder spasm, prostate-related retention, strictures, dysuria, etc. has role in getting CKD.
Definitely, it has a role in play in CKD, because it causes a lot of tubular interstitial damage. It causes reflux. It causes reflux and definitely chronic tubular interstitial disease. Obstructed kidneys are not good. They are not healthy. Chronic obstruction puts a lot of pressure on the glomeruli and the tubules, and hence over time there can be atrophy. So
Okay,
should be looked into.
Dr. Sunita has asked, chelation is safe for kidney therapy?
Chelation.
Yeah.
Chelation is heavy metal, the utilization of the heavy metals. So heavy metals by itself are not would not be recommended for kidney ailments.
Okay, madam. Maniar has again asked, patient with uric acid diathesis are prone for CKD in long run?
So they are prone to CKD because of a variety of reasons. Because if they have increased uric acid production, if they have gout, then not only are they taking the painkillers, they are taking a large number of painkillers. Secondly, they are also on hyperuricuric drugs. So they are prone for and also uric acid stones. So these patients are hence at higher risk for CKD versus patients who don't have high uric acids.
Okay, madam. Any newer medication to reverse CKD?
So the newer you can't reverse CKD, but you can slow the progression.
Yes, ma'am.
Slow the progression would be SGLT2 inhibitors. In diabetics, it is finerenone, which I spoke about. Also, patients who are obese. So obese, I did not touch upon that topic. Obesity-related CKD is, of course, because of the metabolic syndrome. And now GLP-1 receptor agonists are also being used, like the Rybelsus, Mounjaro. Rybelsus has shown benefit in patients who are diabetic, obese, and more studies are required to give us more, enlighten us more on that, but definitely will have a role to play.
Madam, Dr. Maniar again has EMPA or DAPA more efficient to help kidney?
Both the studies have been done on both EMPA and DAPA, and they are equally beneficial.
Okay, madam. Indication for starting dialysis in CKD?
So the indication for starting, so earlier there used to be a blanket rule of less than 10, we should start patients on dialysis. But then studies showed that patients, whether was there a benefit in patients started at GFR of 10 versus GFR of 5 or 12. So it is very individual based. It depends on the symptomatology. the well-being of the patients. So some patients the red flags for initiating dialysis would be anorexia, nausea, vomiting, loss of weight, the malnutrition. Patient starts having water retention. So there's edema, oliguria, breathlessness, altered sensorium. So they're feeling more sleepy, getting confused. These are all red flags, and the patient should be started on dialysis.
Okay, ma'am. Dr. Vikrant Pawar, role of serum phosphate and phosphate binders, when to use, sir?
So serum phosphate, as I said, very important. When the levels are more than 5.5 is when we start using phosphate binders. We want to keep always the levels between 3.5 to 5.5 of serum phosphorus. The choice of therapy depends on also both the calcium levels and the phosphorus because they go hand in hand. So if the calcium levels are high, then you would only give a non-calcium based phosphate binder versus if the calcium levels are low.
Okay, ma'am. Dose of Fineron.
10 milligrams once a day should be initiated. Then if tolerated, then it can be increased to 20 milligrams once a day.
Okay, one more class. Hello.
Sorry?
If the kidney transplant fails after 5 years, they can do a dialysis again?
Yes. If once the transplant fails and they have graft nephropathy, then definitely they can be reinitiated on dialysis.
Or again we need to transplant again?
Yes, second transplant can also be done. The fitness for the second transplant depends a lot. They can easily do the second transplant. It depends a lot on the well-being of the patient. I mean, they should be medically fit to do the second transplant. But we do it all the time, second transplant or even third transplants.
Madam, what is the lifespan of the dialysis and kidney transplant?
So definitely quality and quantity of life on dialysis is inferior to transplant. The average lifespan would be of dialysis patients would be 8 years to 15 years, I would say. Usually we don't, by 15 years, most patients are 12 to 15 years they would start having a lot of complications of dialysis. The transplant, there is no life. Usually, we have transplant patients who come who've been with their graft for 20 years, 25 years. So if they do well, and if they are regimented in their medication and in preventing any infection, then they usually do well.
Okay, madam. Dr. Prajakta has androgenic alopecia. Some females taking tablet Eldocton 50 milligram tablet daily and minoxidil 2.5 milligram 1/4 tablet daily given by trichologist. Is there any long-term side effects like renal or anything?
With minoxidil and Eldocton?
Yes, ma'am.
No side effects as such.
Okay, ma'am.
But madam, the Eldocton contains spironolactone and the hyperkalemia can occur with that.
So if the kidney function is normal, sir, then it should not be an issue.
Okay.
Madam, at what stage of CKD should Sobicis Sport be started? Also, patient with high BP, can they be given soda bicarb?
So Sobosis, excellent question actually. Acidosis is one of the complications which starts setting in as we progress from stage 3 to stage 5. So usually stage 4 or so, when the GFR is between 15 to 30 is when we start seeing acidemia. Whenever the bicarb target is 22, so if the serum bicarb levels are less than that, it should be initiated, can be given even in hypertensive patients, and there's no issue. Because maintenance of acid base is extremely important, it's important for cardiovascular health, to decrease the tubulointerstitial load and inflammation, and also for renal, bone and mineral disorders.
Okay, madam. Thanks. Ravindra Narvekar has asked, at what level erythropoietin injection should be given?
So if the target hemoglobin for CKD patients is 10 to 11, if the level of hemoglobin is less than 10, definitely should be initiated. Erythropoietin should be initiated. When you initiate erythropoietin, keep in mind, do they have the iron stores? Because just starting erythropoietin by itself may not serve the purpose. Iron stores should be replete. Then erythropoietin is a great idea. Once they reach targets, you need to de-escalate. But it should be made very clear just how you will have aspirin all your life when you have a cardiovascular disease, when you've had an MI. Same way, erythropoietin is part of your prescription. It's just that the dose may be titrated up and down depending on the hemoglobin levels.
Okay, ma'am. Which formula to calculate eGFR in Indian content? Dr. Amit Thakkar has asked.
Sure. So the eGFR calculation nowadays, the formula which is widely used by all of us is the CKD EPI formula, which uses serum creatinine, the gender, and the age as demographics. Earlier, prior to this, maybe a decade ago, we used to use the Cockcroft-Lawler formula, but now the CKD EPI formula is being used.
Okay, ma'am. Dr. Beena Upadhyay has asked, can a person have only proteinuria but good GFR of 100?
Absolutely. Isolated proteinuria, very common nephrotic syndrome patients who we have, especially, I mean, whether it's kids or adults, when they are nephrotic, many of them have normal serum creatinine levels, and they may have nephrotic range proteinuria more than 3 grams, 4 grams, and very, very common.
Okay, madam. Dr. Amit Thakkar has something on newer drug for anemia due to CKD.
So there is the newer prolyl hydroxylase in this thing in it. I'm just blanking out on the name.
Okay.
Yeah, so it can there is a newer medication can be given 3 times a week, 50 milligrams or 100 milligrams 3 times a week, and the inducer for that is hypoxia, and widely used has been initially it was said that you have to use it only with in isolation. So you use either erythropoietin or the pH alpha hydroxylase inhibitors, but now we even tried hybrid that for a time being they are on both and great results.
Okay, ma'am. Dr. Amina has asked safest PPI for CKD patient.
So ranitidine definitely is a safer PPI for CKD patients because the PPIs, the omeprazoles and all, the H2 receptor and blockers have shown higher. They have progression of CKD. They've shown osteoporosis. So ranitidine would be for long-term CKD.
Okay, ma'am. Dr. Maniar has asked, it is true, madam, that CKD patients are prone to get fatal arrhythmias and resulting in cardiac arrest.
So any patient with CKD, they have a much higher chance of cardiovascular events. Arrhythmias extremely common. They may start as just APCs or VPCs, and the arrhythmias are not only they can be because of multiple reasons. A can be because of coronary artery disease. B could be because of electrolytes. So potassium, calcium, magnesium, all three are extremely important and very dynamic in this population. So all three, or these would be the underlying reasons for arrhythmias in CKD population.
Now, I think one last question, Dr. Jumani, something on IgA nephropathy in young management.
So IgA nephropathy, very prevalent, highly underdiagnosed, and we should keep an eye out for patients who have microscopic hematuria. Treatment line for them would be first CKD management. Would be salt restriction. So you don't want these patients with IgA nephropathy to become hypertensive because now they have an established nephritis. So the hypertension needs to be controlled. ACE/ARBs for controlling the proteinuria. Fish oil was used still is one of the simpler agents can be used. As IgA nephropathy progresses, then steroids and immunosuppressive medications are being utilized.
That's all. Thank you very much, madam.
Lot of thanks.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. As we come to the to close of the insightful 300 webinar, it's my privilege to deliver the vote of thanks on behalf of General Practitioner Association in collaboration with Jaslok Hospital and Research Center. I sincerely thank our speaker, Dr. Ruchi Samdani, for a wonderful enlightening section, and your thoughts have truly enriched our understanding of the topic failing kidney. I also like to thank our participants